A Marine encountered an unexpected conflict with his homeowners association, HOA, over his parking spot. Frustrated by the situation, he found a clever way to address the issue that surprised the HOA members. David Thompson, a 32-year-old Marine sergeant, returned home to Cedar Ridge after 12 years of service. As he arrived, the neighborhood's unusual quietness unsettled him. He brushed off the feeling, attributing it to his combat-honed instincts, still adjusting to civilian life. The house he bought 3 years ago stood before him, a symbol of the roots he hoped to establish after years of transient military life. David longed for peace and quiet, unaware of the challenges that lay ahead. Cedar Ridge was governed by a notoriously strict homeowners association, HOA, led by Harold Jefferson, a retired businessman in his late 60s. Harold's reputation for ruthlessly enforcing even the most minor rules preceded him, though David had never met him personally. Harold saw the HOA as his domain, a way for him to retain a sense of control in retirement. The HOA, in his view, wasn't just a way to maintain the aesthetics of the community, but also a platform to exercise the power he felt he had earned through a life of hard work. This desire for control made Harold relentless when it came to enforcing regulations, and anyone who challenged the HOA faced an uphill battle. That evening, as David unpacked, he heard footsteps outside his door. A folded paper appeared beneath it, bearing the HOA's letterhead. The notice cited new rules about aesthetically pleasing vehicles and visible parking spots, leaving David perplexed and frustrated. It seemed his hopes for a tranquil homecoming were about to be tested by the HOA's peculiar demands. David had always viewed his truck, a reliable Ford F-150, as a part of his identity, a vehicle that had traveled with him through thick and thin, over terrains both domestic and abroad. It was not just a vehicle, but a symbol of endurance and survival. The notice, however, implied that his beloved truck did not meet the HOA's standards for aesthetic appeal. David was dismayed to read the new rule. Only approved vehicles could be visibly parked, with others requiring garage storage or facing fines. The rule had been passed during his deployment without his knowledge, leaving David feeling betrayed. He knew he was legally entitled to his parking spot and wasn't keen on rearranging his garage to comply. After all, his garage was filled with belongings from his years of service, memories, keepsakes, and items that had been with him from post to post, pieces of his life that couldn't be simply discarded or stored elsewhere. The next morning, another letter arrived from Harold Jefferson, the HOA president, demanding immediate compliance. David's irritation grew at the cold, inflexible tone that ignored his circumstances. The letter was blunt, giving no room for compromise or discussion. The words cut through any sense of welcome David had felt upon returning to the neighborhood, replacing it with a growing sense of alienation. This was not the homecoming he had envisioned. Deciding to address the issue directly, David drafted a respectful but firm response. He explained that his garage was full of belongings from his years of service, making it impossible to park his truck there. He requested an exemption based on his military service and the truck's long-standing presence. Though David hoped for understanding, he suspected that Harold's notorious rigidity might make diplomacy challenging. Nevertheless, he felt compelled to try reasoning with the HOA before considering other options. David was used to conflicts that could be solved with mutual respect and straightforward communication, and he hoped this would be no different. David submitted his request for an exemption to the HOA, hoping for understanding. A week later, he received a curt rejection from Harold and the board, giving him 2 weeks to comply or face daily fines. The language in the letter was formal and distant, emphasizing the consequences of noncompliance, with barely a mention of David's circumstances or his contribution to the country. Angered by the disrespect, David's resolve strengthened. It was not just about a parking spot anymore. It was about standing up for what was right. The situation escalated when his neighbor, Mrs. Collins, revealed some backstory to Harold's behavior. Mrs. Collins, a longtime resident, confided that Harold harbored a grudge against military vehicles due to his son's rejection from the armed forces years ago. This personal vendetta added a painful layer of complexity to the conflict. It became clear that this was not simply about neighborhood aesthetics. Harold had a deep-seated bias that made David's request personal. Mrs. Collins, an elderly lady with a kind disposition, expressed her dismay at Harold's behavior. She felt that the community should be a place where people like David, who had served the country, were welcomed and appreciated, not penalized. As the deadline approached, David weighed his options: comply and avoid fines, or stand up to what he saw as unjust treatment. The neighborhood became divided over the issue. Some residents supported David, admiring his military service and viewing the HOA's actions as excessive. These residents, mostly younger families or those with military backgrounds, saw the rule as an unnecessary restriction and an insult to a man who had given so much for his country. Others, fearing repercussions, sided with the HOA. Many of them were longtime residents who preferred not to cross Harold, whose influence over the HOA was well established. They were reluctant to get involved, wary of drawing unwanted attention from the HOA and fearing that they might be the next target of enforcement. The conflict had grown beyond a simple parking dispute into a test of community values and power dynamics. It became a focal point of discussion at neighborhood gatherings, with some neighbors discreetly approaching David to express their support, while others avoided eye contact altogether, unwilling to take sides. David, now aware of the personal nature of Harold's actions, felt even more determined to stand his ground against what he perceived as bullying tactics. He would not allow Harold's prejudices to dictate his right to peacefully reside in his own home. The neighborhood split into two factions, those supporting David and those backing the HOA's strict rules. As tensions rose, the HOA escalated its efforts, sending frequent warning letters and imposing daily fines on David. Tow trucks began appearing near his property as a threat, idling ominously on the street as a constant reminder of the consequences David would face if he refused to comply. It felt to David as though Harold was attempting to intimidate him into submission, turning the simple act of parking his truck into a daily battle. The conflict peaked when Harold Jefferson personally confronted David at his home, coldly asserting his authority. It was early one morning, and David was in his driveway, about to leave for an errand. He heard the sharp click of shoes on pavement and turned to see Harold striding towards him, his expression grim. Harold's voice was stern, his words sharp as he informed David that the fines were accumulating and that his vehicle was a blight on the community's image. David could hardly believe the words coming out of Harold's mouth. The disdain was palpable, and the complete lack of empathy was evident. David, frustrated by the relentless pressure, considered legal action but decided against it due to potential costs. He wasn't one to back down from a challenge, but taking on the HOA in court would require money and resources that he was not willing to expend at that moment. Instead, David's military strategic thinking kicked in. He meticulously studied the HOA bylaws, searching for a solution. He spent late nights reading the dense, jargon-filled documents, highlighting sections, and making notes. It wasn't long before he discovered a forgotten loophole. Homeowners could propose rule changes with enough resident signatures, leading to a community vote. This discovery gave David hope. He realized he could potentially use the HOA's own regulations to challenge their authority and resolve the conflict on his terms. The irony of using the bylaws that had caused him so much trouble wasn't lost on him as he began to formulate his plan. This was a different kind of battle, but it was one he was prepared to fight with all the persistence and determination he had learned in the Marines. David devised a plan to propose a new HOA rule allowing parking exceptions for active duty and veteran residents. He began gathering support by talking to sympathetic neighbors, appealing to their sense of fairness and desire to curb HOA overreach. He started with Mrs. Collins, who had already shown her support, and she in turn introduced him to others who were equally frustrated by the HOA's increasingly arbitrary rules. Many residents, especially veterans and their families, responded positively. To David's surprise, there were more veterans in the neighborhood than he had realized, people who had also felt the sting of Harold's heavy-handed leadership. Despite resistance from Harold's supporters, David gained momentum. He spoke with neighbors in person, knocking on doors, and sharing his story. He found common ground with those who had also experienced difficulties with the HOA, and his message began to resonate. A retired judge, Mr. Donovan, publicly endorsed David's proposal, swaying many undecided residents. Mr. Donovan was well-respected in the community, and his support lent David's campaign credibility. Mr. Donovan made it clear that this wasn't just about David. It was about fairness and the ability of residents to live without undue interference from the HOA. With enough signatures, David formally submitted his petition to the HOA. Caught off guard, the HOA was forced to accept the petition and schedule a community vote. Harold, feeling threatened, launched a smear campaign against David, accusing him of undermining the HOA for personal gain. He distributed flyers suggesting that David was trying to weaken the community's standards and that his actions were selfishly motivated. However, this tactic backfired, further alienating residents already skeptical of the HOA's leadership. People who had initially been hesitant to choose a side began to see Harold's actions for what they were, a desperate attempt to maintain power. The conflict had evolved from a personal dispute into a community movement challenging the HOA's authority. David's determination grew stronger in the face of Harold's aggressive tactics, setting the stage for a pivotal community vote. The vote became the talk of the neighborhood. At gatherings, in stores, and during casual walks, residents discussed their perspectives on the issue. The stakes felt high. It was no longer just about a parking spot, but about the kind of neighborhood Cedar Ridge wanted to be. As the community vote neared, Harold attempted a last-minute bylaw change to require a supermajority for new rules. It was a desperate move, and it almost succeeded. Harold had called an emergency board meeting to discuss the change, hoping that the residents wouldn't have time to react. But David and Mr. Donovan quickly rallied opposition, spreading the word through the neighborhood and urging people to attend the meeting and voice their disapproval. They gathered at Mrs. Jenkins's house, who was also sympathetic to David's cause, to strategize and ensure they had enough people present to counter Harold's maneuver. On voting day, the community center was packed with residents eager to have their say. The atmosphere was tense as votes were cast and tallied. The sense of anticipation in the room was palpable. David stood at the back, watching as people filed in, some nodding to him in support, others looking uncertain. It was a moment of truth, not just for David, but for everyone who believed in fairness and justice. Harold sat at the front, his expression carefully controlled, but there was an edge to his demeanor that betrayed his anxiety. David's proposal passed decisively, marking a significant shift in Cedar Ridge's power dynamics. The victory represented more than just David's personal vindication. It symbolized a community standing up against perceived injustice. Cheers erupted in the community center when the results were announced. Neighbors who had previously been too afraid to voice their opinions now found the courage to stand up. David was congratulated by people he had never met, all thanking him for taking a stand and making Cedar Ridge a place where residents had a say in their community. Harold's influence waned as the old guard's grip on the neighborhood loosened. The next morning, David's truck stood unmolested in its spot, free from threats of fines or towing. Neighbors began to see David in a new light, not just as a Marine, but as someone who had fought for the community's rights. What had started as a personal battle had become a unifying moment for Cedar Ridge. Inspired by David's success, other residents began challenging the HOA's unreasonable rules. The board, once in firm control, found themselves facing widespread opposition. Harold Jefferson's influence rapidly declined as the community's power dynamics shifted. Unable to suppress the growing resistance, Harold resigned from his position as HOA head, citing personal reasons. In truth, it was a forced resignation. The community had lost faith in his leadership, and even his most ardent supporters began to distance themselves. The relief among residents was evident, and the resignation marked the end of an era of fear and intimidation. The community then elected Mrs. Jenkins, a compassionate neighbor, to lead the HOA. Under her guidance, the focus shifted from rigid rule enforcement to fostering a sense of community and collaboration. Mrs. Jenkins, unlike Harold, believed in the power of dialogue and compromise. She began by organizing a community meeting where residents could voice their concerns and discuss the rules that affected their daily lives. David attended the meeting, not as a dissenter, but as a valued member of the community. The meeting was productive, with residents openly discussing the changes they wanted to see. It was a stark contrast to the atmosphere under Harold's leadership, and it became clear that the neighborhood was ready for a fresh start. David continued to live in Cedar Ridge, his actions leaving a lasting impact. He became a cornerstone of the neighborhood's new spirit, always ready to help others and embodying the values he had fought for. His determination and courage had inspired others to speak up, and the neighborhood began to transform into a place where residents felt they had a voice. The HOA, once a symbol of oppression and strict control, became an organization that worked for the residents, not against them. One of the first major initiatives under Mrs. Jenkins was to create a veteran support program within the neighborhood. David, along with other veterans, was instrumental in its creation. They organized events, helped each other with projects, and provided support to families of active duty service members. It was a way for the community to give back, and for David, it was a way to continue serving, albeit in a different capacity. The changes in Cedar Ridge were profound. Neighbors who had previously kept to themselves began interacting more, brought together by the shared struggle against Harold's oppressive rules. Barbecues, block parties, and neighborhood cleanup days became common events, and David often found himself at the center of these gatherings. His garage, once filled with the remnants of his military life, was slowly organized with the help of neighbors, creating space for a workshop where he could tinker with projects and help others with repairs. David's truck, which had once been the source of so much conflict, became a symbol of the neighborhood's resilience. It was no longer just his truck. It represented the victory of community over authoritarian rule. Whenever David drove through the neighborhood, people waved, and children would point to it, knowing the story of how their parents and neighbors had stood together to protect their rights. The impact of the conflict with the HOA reached beyond Cedar Ridge. Word of David's story spread, and soon other neighborhoods began to question the power dynamics within their own HOAs. David was contacted by people from other communities, asking for advice on how to challenge unfair rules and assert their rights. He became an unwitting spokesperson for a movement that was much larger than just Cedar Ridge, a movement that sought to return power to the residents of HOA-governed neighborhoods everywhere. David was often invited to speak at neighborhood meetings, sharing his story and encouraging others to stand up for what they believed in. He spoke not just about the conflict, but about the importance of community, of knowing your neighbors, and of being willing to take a stand when things were unjust. His speeches were never about anger or resentment, but about hope, unity, and the belief that people working together could create positive change. Cedar Ridge had undergone a transformation, and David had played a key role in that journey. The neighborhood was no longer just a place where people lived, it was a community in the truest sense of the word. The relationships formed during the struggle against Harold's leadership deepened, creating bonds that went beyond mere proximity. People looked out for one another, and the HOA, under Mrs. Jenkins's compassionate leadership, supported initiatives that brought neighbors together rather than dividing them. David often reflected on how far the community had come since the day he returned home from his deployment, expecting nothing more than a quiet life. He never imagined that he would find himself at the center of a community movement, yet he wouldn't have changed a thing. The experience had brought him closer to his neighbors and had given him a new purpose, to help build the kind of community that everyone deserved. Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this exciting story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more inspiring tales.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.